Imagine a peasant family huddled inside a timber cottage while a blizzard screams outside. The wind whistles through cracks in the walls, but they aren't lighting a massive fire. Instead, the father is smearing thick animal fat over his children's faces and hands. This grease creates a waterproof barrier against the biting dampness. Then, they begin the shielding process. Each person pulls on 3 or 4 tunics made of raw, unwashed wool. But here's the strange part: the wool is still oily. It's filled with natural lanolin from the sheep, which acts like a primitive raincoat to keep the moisture out. They wrap their legs tightly in long linen strips called wanigas, winding them from ankle to knee until their limbs look like bandages. By the time they are finished, the family members look twice their normal size, encased in a massive mechanical cocoon of fiber. And then it gets weirder: they don't move much. They sit perfectly still to trap every ounce of rising body heat within those oily layers. What happened next was the real test of survival. As the room temperature drops toward freezing, the wool layers begin to act like a thermos, recycling their own breath and skin heat to create a microclimate. It wasn't comfortable or clean, but it was the only thing standing between them and the grave. Imagine a medieval farmer dragging his straw mattress across a dirt floor toward a row of wooden stalls. He isn't going to check on his animals, he's moving in with them. In a standard longhouse, the family lives on one side while the oxen and cows live on the other, separated only by thin wooden slats. The farmer settles his bedding directly against the partition, leaning his back against the vibrating wood. But here's the strange part: he isn't lonely or crazy, he's using a biological battery. A single cow produces as much heat as a modern space heater, and he has 4 of them. As the animals breathe and shift, their massive body heat radiates through the slats and warms the farmer's spine. And then it gets worse. The smell of manure and damp fur is overwhelming, but the air near the cows is 10 degrees warmer than the rest of the house. You might think this was just for the poor, but what happened next was a matter of survival for everyone. On the coldest nights, the entire family would pile into the hay just inches from the livestock. They watched the steam rise off the oxen's backs in the moonlight, using the animals' massive caloric output to keep the room from freezing. It was a smelly, noisy, and cramped way to live, but by turning their home into a giant stable, they stayed alive without burning a single log. One kick from a restless cow could break a rib, but that was a risk they took to avoid waking up covered in frost. Imagine an elderly woman standing over a dying fire, holding a pair of heavy iron tongs. She isn't cooking dinner, she is hunting for the largest, smoothest river stones sitting in the glowing embers. She carefully lifts a gray stone, now radiating a dull, intense heat, and drops it onto a pile of thick wool scraps. But here's the strange part: she isn't trying to hide the heat, she's building a medieval battery. She wraps the scorching rock in layers of fabric until it's safe to touch, then carries it across the freezing stone floor to her bed. She slides the bundle deep under the heavy blankets, right where her feet will rest. And then it gets worse. The air in her room is so cold that her breath turns to mist, but the dense stone stays hot for hours. What happened next was a clever trick of physics. As she curls up, the stone releases its trapped energy slowly, heating the small pocket of air beneath the covers. Without this hot rock, the damp cold of the stone walls would seep into her bones by midnight. Instead, she sleeps through the frost because she brought a piece of the hearth into her bed. It was a simple, tactile solution to a deadly problem. If the stone touched her bare skin, it would leave a nasty burn, so she had to keep it perfectly wrapped in its woolen jacket all night long. This was the only way to survive in a room where the water in the wash basin was literally turning to ice just a few feet away. Imagine 5 weary travelers walking into a dark, freezing barn after a day on the road. Instead of looking for beds, they head straight for a massive mound of dry golden straw stacked in the corner. They begin digging frantically with their hands, carving out a deep hollow in the center of the pile. But here's the strange part: they aren't making separate beds, they are climbing in together. One by one, they crawl into the hole and pull the loose straw over their bodies until only their eyes and noses are visible. And then it gets worse. The air in the barn is so cold that the hay stalks are covered in a thin layer of frost. They huddle shoulder to shoulder, pressing their backs against each other to share every bit of leaking body heat. What happened next was a triumph of primitive engineering. The hollow straw tubes trap millions of tiny air pockets, creating a natural insulation shield that rivals a modern sleeping bag. As the travelers breathe, the small nest begins to warm up from their collective 98-degree body temperatures. In a world where privacy was a death sentence, stacking humans was the only way to keep the blood flowing. If one person tried to sleep alone on the floor, they would likely never wake up. By dawn, the travelers emerge from the pile covered in dust and itchy stalks, but they are alive and warm. They traded personal space for a biological furnace, turning a pile of animal feed into a life-saving sanctuary against the winter night. Imagine a wealthy merchant climbing into a massive wooden bed that looks more like a giant cabinet than a piece of furniture. He isn't just lying down. He is preparing to seal himself inside a wooden fortress. He reaches out and pulls heavy, floor-to-ceiling wool curtains shut, blocking out the rest of the dark, drafty stone room. But here's the strange part. He is intentionally trapping himself in a tiny box. He pulls a thick, heavy bear fur over his head and curls into a ball. This box bed serves as a room within a room, cutting the volume of air he needs to heat by 90%. And then it gets worse. Outside the curtains, the temperature in the Great Hall is so low that water in the bedside pitcher is freezing solid. What happened next was a clever use of human biology. As the merchant breathes, the tiny space inside the curtains begins to capture the humidity and heat from his lungs. Within 20 minutes, the air around him is 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the house. He isn't trying to fight the winter in the whole manor, he is only fighting it in those 50 cubic feet of space. Even the wealthiest nobles lived like this because stone walls were impossible to keep warm. By morning, he emerges from his warm fur cocoon back into the stinging cold of the open room, having used nothing but his own breath to stay toasted all night. It was the ultimate medieval life hack for those who could afford the wood and the wool. Imagine a stable hand standing in the freezing mud outside a small village hut, shoveling massive piles of steaming animal manure. He isn't cleaning up. He is deliberately banking the filth against the exterior walls of the house. He uses his wooden pitchfork to pack the wet straw and dung into a thick, waist-high layer. But here's the strange part. As he works, he plunges his bare hands deep into the center of the rotting pile to check its temperature. The mound is actually hot to the touch. This is because medieval peasants turned their homes into giant compost bins to survive the winter. And then it gets worse. The smell of the fermenting waste is unbearable, but the chemical reaction of the rot is generating 140 degrees of heat. What happened next was a stroke of survival genius. This heating jacket of manure acted as an external furnace, preventing the frost from penetrating the thin mud and straw walls. Inside the hut, the family could feel the warmth radiating through the timber, even though the fire in their hearth was long dead. If the stable hands stopped stacking the waste, the wind would freeze the walls brittle by midnight. Instead, the family lived in a bubble of foul-smelling but life-saving heat. They traded a clean scent for the only thing that could stop the winter from creeping through their very bones. It was a disgusting, steaming shield, but it worked better than almost any other trick they had. Imagine a village laborer sitting on a splintered wooden bench just as the sun begins to crack over a frozen horizon. He isn't reaching for a cup of water or coffee. Instead, he pulls a steaming clay bowl toward him filled with a thick, murky liquid. He grips a wooden spoon and begins shoveling a mixture of heavy oats and warm, fermented ale into his mouth. But here's the strange part. This isn't just a meal, it's a form of internal combustion. In the Middle Ages, staying warm started from the inside out by forcing the body's metabolism into overdrive. And then it gets worse. The air is so cold that the laborer's beard is white with frost, yet he gulps down the grainy, alcoholic sludge as fast as he can. What happened next was a calculated biological reaction. The high-calorie sugars in the warm beer provided an immediate spike in energy, while the alcohol widened his blood vessels to push warmth to his freezing fingers and toes. This liquid fire allowed him to pick up his iron tools and start working in the fields when any other person would be shivering uncontrollably. While we might see this as a heavy morning drink, for him, it was a vital survival tool. He wasn't trying to get a buzz. He was fueling a biological furnace that would keep his heart beating through 10 hours of manual labor in the ice. By the time the bowl was scraped clean, his skin would be flushed and warm, ready to face a world that was trying to freeze him solid.